While many people think that entrepreneurship is a field of risk and impulse moves, in fact, a great deal of research has affirmed the opposite, that most very successful entrepreneurs are risk managers, willing to take small or large leaps, but based on data and the confidence of knowing that they have the ability to adapt flexibly to the unexpected. Various frameworks of entrepreneurial process and entrepreneurial analysis have been developed by researchers to describe what individuals encounter and to help them navigate. What I want to share today is in some limited way one of those frameworks, though it might be more accurately labeled a theory, and it's called effectuation, a word that pretty much no one ever uses. It's a very fancy word for some very, very commonsensical thinking. It's thus not necessarily the word that I want you guys to remember over the long term. It describes real behavior in a way that I think is powerful, and that's what matters. It's a robust theory developed by a professor named Sarah Sarasvathy out of the University of Virginia's Darden School. Historically, entrepreneurship, both greenfield entrepreneurship, brand new ventures, and corporate entrepreneurship, has been built on the notion that people can predict the future. They can determine where markets are. They can then pursue those markets with products and services that can be tested so effectively that when launched, there's a maximized likelihood of success. In fact, we find in corporate entrepreneurship and in greenfield entrepreneurship that such predictability is a myth, and much more so in the latter, where there's no precedent and the safety net of an existing organization is not available. We know that entrepreneurs quote-unquote suffer, though it's not necessarily an affliction, from what's called an optimism bias. They expect success. That's a great thing. It's arguably essential for a career path that will almost always involve ups and downs. It keeps people motivated. But we also know that luck and the unexpected play a role in helping success emerge. No one knows who said this quote originally, but it's credited to a Danish Nobel laureate, Niels Bohr. It's a funny sentence if you think about it, but it's also true. Sometimes very successful entrepreneurs will explain that planning helped them predict perfectly, and then they'll tell you to plan. When they say these sorts of things, it's important to remember that the described accuracy was probably, in part, a serendipitous accident. For most entrepreneurs, particularly those who are experts and those who launch multiple businesses successfully, with perhaps some modicum of failure thrown in there for good measure, there's a realization that entrepreneurship rarely involves pursuit of a defined and predictable end. It rarely involves something that can be planned to perfection. Entrepreneurship usually involves the pursuit of a feasible end based on the needs that a person has. The notion, therefore, is that expert entrepreneurs determine their means first, not the end. They'll identify their means and then pursue an end, and that end should be something that's within reach. Once that end is reached, or some alternative end that approximates it, they can then reassess their means, which might have changed, to pursue a new end or a new goal. Entrepreneurship, thus described, is an iterative process, or at least an incrementally advancing one. Let me talk you through effectual entrepreneurship or effectuation in terms of some of its basic components. All, I think, will, again, resonate at the level of, this just makes basic common sense to me. Nonetheless, they're not at the core of how people were taught entrepreneurship for a very long time, or even at the core of how people were encouraged to pursue it. Historically, people were encouraged to pursue entrepreneurship by developing 30 or 40-page business plans, which summarized every little detail about how a business would be launched and grown. As I said earlier in the term, people don't do that anymore. Effectuation theory describes a different set of principles, and I'll share a subset of them. The first, I've already referenced, albeit without the name, the bird-in-hand principle. The notion here is that when expert entrepreneurs set out to build a venture, they don't seek a possibility that's grand and glorious and so far in the future that its likelihood is small, even though they might dream of that. They seek to build something based on who they are, what they know, and who they know. The expert entrepreneur imagines the possibilities that can originate from their means. A second principle here is the notion of affordable loss. This principle describes another fact to which I've already alluded, namely that while many people might think that entrepreneurship is about being the lone hero or taking the big risk, in fact, the most successful entrepreneurs are risk managers. They limit or spread their risk by understanding what they can afford to lose or what they're willing to lose at each and every step in the process. They don't necessarily swing for the fences. Instead, they choose the goals and actions where they know they're likely to make progress, even if the worst-case scenario or the downside occurs. Hopefully, you can see as I describe these that effectuation represents a very intentional and realistic reframing of entrepreneurship away from the sort of mythologized notion of the entrepreneur as a person who dives off of a cliff and hopes that at the end of the day they land not on rocks, but in the open sea of, say, Google-style IPO. The third principle that I'll share is the lemonade principle. We all know that old saying about making lemonade out of lemons. This principle suggests that successful entrepreneurs not only know how to make the lemonade, but that they expect to have to make lemonade. Instead of trying to prepare themselves for worst-case scenarios, instead of dealing with the unexpected as terrible, they embrace the unexpected and look within for opportunities. They don't view the unexpected as necessarily bad. They look at the unexpected as a clue. perhaps to new products, to new services, to new markets. Principle number 4 today is the patchwork quilt principle, which concerns social networking. It's the notion that entrepreneurs, in trying to manage or minimize risk, will utilize partnerships and alliances to effectively reduce uncertainty and to create new markets. And in so doing, they proactively get away from acting alone and, of course, spread their risk. That brings us to the last principle of today's discussion, the pilot and the plane principle. The notion here, going back to the beginning of this discussion, is that we can control what happens at a certain level, but we can't predict what's going to happen with perfection. Just as the pilot knows to anticipate weather but doesn't always know when or how it will hit, the entrepreneur knows how to anticipate business variability. The expert entrepreneur is one who can navigate or fly the plane around the weather. So that's effectuation in a nutshell. The expert and successful entrepreneur begins with his or her means, establishes his or her goals based on those, and then adapts flexibly as he or she moves forwards or sideways or backwards so as to productively and constructively move forward again. That's effectuation.